If you're a high achiever, your brain is probably always on. It's part of what made you successful. But when it's time to relax, it's like you can't find the pause button. I understand this so well. As an attorney, I was trained to think like a lawyer, which essentially means I know how to imagine the worst case scenario so that I can better advise my clients. But when I walked into my life, I would try to force my brain to stop thinking, which only made it worse. Here's what finally changed everything for me. I learned that you don't quiet an overactive brain, you give it structure. So in this video, I'm going to share 4 questions I have learned to ask myself when my brain just won't shut up and I need to relax. Because your brain isn't looking to be silenced, it's looking for resolution. So the answer isn't less thinking, it's better thinking, so that you can arrive to a conclusion that your brain can live with, so it can settle and you can relax. If you're a professional who solves complex problems all day at work, but you feel like you have no control over your mind, this video is especially for you. Hi, my name is Overthinking. I'm an attorney who's been trained to ask the right questions. Now I use the same tools to help high achievers improve the quality of their lives. All right, so let's get started. The first question you want to ask is, what actually happened? Not what you think happened, but what actually happened. If there was a camera recording the whole incident, what would the camera capture? What this means is you want to focus on just the facts, no emotions, just logic. A fact is something that can be verified. It's extremely objective. We're not looking for the story you're trying to layer on top of the fact. We want to take the story out and just look at it with non-judgmental eyes. So let's use an example. Let's say you're in a meeting and you said something and for whatever reason, it didn't come out the right way, right? It didn't land the right way. Personally, I remember this happening to me a lot when I would go to the courtroom. There's so much pressure in the room. Like, you're not going to always say the right things the right way. So you're in a meeting, you said something, it didn't land the right way. That's the fact. That's what a camera would have captured. Maybe you stumbled over your words or for whatever reason, it didn't come out perfectly. But here's what your brain does next. And that's the dangerous part, right? Your brain doesn't stop at the fact. It immediately goes to, oh, I said something awkward and everyone noticed and now they're judging me and now they all hate me and I'm gonna lose my job and I'm getting fired. You jump from fact to interpretation in a matter of seconds. And the reason for this is your brain is naturally wired to predict danger. And especially as a high achiever, like, your brain is really good at that. Naturally, it treats every small mistake you make as if it was a big threat. So when something uncomfortable happens, right? Like saying something in a meeting that wasn't perfect, your brain immediately starts interpreting it instead of just observing it. It jumps from what happens to what it means in like seconds. The problem here is this happens so quick, you don't even realize you made that jump. And because you don't realize it, you're thinking the story is the fact. So the first question is designed to slow that process down a little bit, to create space between what happened and what you think it means. So when you feel like you're losing control of your brain, go back to the basics. Ask yourself, what actually happened here? An easy method to do this, I call it the silent movie method. You try to imagine what happened, but you turn all the sound off, right? If you were just looking at what happened, like logically, someone just watching it without hearing what was being said, without hearing any reactions to it, or even without hearing your thoughts about it, what would they see? And the reason why this is so helpful is once you have the fact, then your brain can kind of take a break from the catastrophe you're creating in your mind, because now it can focus on something real, right? Instead of something you're imagining in your head. Now, the second question you want to ask is, what story am I telling about the fact? Like I mentioned earlier, when your brain identifies a potential threat, it doesn't just identify it, it narrates it. It creates a story to try to explain what happened. And that story feels so real that it can feel like the truth. This is something called catastrophic thinking. Your brain takes a small fact and create a whole narrative of disaster around it. And that's because your brain is trying to protect you. And I think once I learned that, I was able to have a bit more sympathy, right? And stop beating myself up so much, because I'm like, this is just trying to protect me. If I can just tell it what's true, or if I can just separate what's real from what I'm just imagining in my head, then it will have the right information so that when there's an actual threat, it can go ahead and protect me. But when there isn't, right, I can find a method for it to understand what is true from what is not true. And that's why these questions are so important. Right, so let's go back to our example. You said something awkward during a meeting. That's a fact. But the story your brain might tell you is, now they think I'm incompetent. I don't feel good enough. I just ruined my credibility. I ruined my reputation. Maybe I'm not qualified for this job. Maybe I should start looking for a different job. Do you see what it did there? You saw how fast that just escalated. You went from, oh, I said something in a meeting that didn't come out right, to I need to change careers. And the reason why the story feels so true is, especially as a high achiever, your brain is really good at connecting the dots. It's really good at anticipating the consequences, but it's not usually accurate. It's usually just a possibility that your brain has decided to focus on. These questions help to make sure that your thoughts are accurate, that your brain is relying on accurate information. So the second question asks you to externalize the story, to create a distance between the fact and the story, and honestly, to be open to the possibility that your story may not be a fact. So again, ask yourself, what's the story and what do you think what happens means about you? Really, it's just our brain is like a meaning-making machine. It wants to understand things. That's its entire job. All you're doing is making sure that it's relying on factual information, not stories and possibilities that can't be proven. And that takes us to question number 3. The third question is my personal favorite because I think that's when I really get to use my legal mind to attack the stories that are not true. And the third question is, if I had to prove this story, what evidence do I actually have? Inherently, this is a legal question. What we don't realize is there is a legal drama happening in our mind, right? And I'm going to make so much more videos about this. If you have any questions, let me know down below in the comments. But there's a legal drama happening in your mind. I call this the mental courtroom. And that's why I love to approach these things from a legal standpoint. So in a courtroom, when a witness testifies and tells a story, no one just assumes the witness is telling the truth, even though they swore to tell the truth. But how many times have we seen that not being the case? All right. So what we do, what a good lawyer does, is question the story, force them to prove it, right? Force them to provide evidence. And the whole point of question number 3 is to make sure that we only keep stories that we can prove in our mind. If you can't prove it, it doesn't get to stay. You know, in law, there's this concept called the burden of proof, right? So if you have a claim and you're saying something happened or someone did you wrong or whatever it is, you have the burden of proving it. No one is just going to believe you just because that's what you think. And the whole point is you need to show your work. You need to show us how you came up with that conclusion. And I think a lot of people can benefit from applying that same concept to their own thoughts. Before believing a thought, what if you ask yourself, what evidence do I have? Can I prove it? To make this more clear, let's go back to our example. You're in a meeting, you said something awkward during a meeting, and now you're telling yourself, they think I'm incompetent, right? They think I don't know what I'm doing and I'm not good enough, or whatever your story is. Now ask yourself, okay, well, if I had to prove this story, what evidence do I have? What evidence do I have to support that they think I'm incompetent? Now, there are different types of evidence that you can use in a courtroom in order to prove a testimony or a story. But ultimately, regardless of the evidence, it has to be something that is reliable, something that is relevant, and authentic. Do I have evidence that's reliable, authentic, and relevant to prove that they think I'm incompetent? In our example, it would be something like, well, did the people in the room come out and tell me like explicitly that they think I'm incompetent? Did they use those exact words? Did they give me feedback that highly suggested that I'm incompetent? Was there a written warning that was given to me? Like what actual evidence, what's something that I can rely on that can prove this story? Or am I just assuming they think I'm incompetent based on how I feel? Here's the thing, right? Feelings matter. Feelings are important, but feelings are not facts. Which means when you're coming up with stories just based on how you feel, it's like you're building a whole case against yourself with zero evidence. And that's when the final question becomes the most useful. The fourth question is, what else could be true here that I'm not considering? When you're overthinking, you get tunnel vision. Okay, your brain tends to get locked into one narrative. And this is something called confirmation bias. Your brain is looking for evidence to confirm the story. And it does this so well that it ignores every other possibility. And because your brain is trying to protect you, naturally it's going to try to focus on the story that creates the worst case scenario because, well, that's the biggest threat that you might be facing. So in the example we were using earlier, your brain decided you said something awkward. Now they think you're not credible and now you're going to get fired. Somehow you've ruined your reputation and you've damaged your credibility. After your brain comes up with that story, that interpretation of the facts, all it does next is looking for confirmation. Any silence is confirmation. Any lack of response is confirmation. Even a neutral reaction is confirmation. All it's doing now is scanning for evidence that the story is right, that you are in fact in danger, that it can't just stop thinking because it has to try to protect you from that threat. Once you've realized that you actually don't have evidence or proof that this story is correct, question 4 then opens up your mind and asks, what other possibilities exist? Question 4 forces you to look for alternative narratives instead, right? If the worst case scenario isn't real, if I'm not in fact in danger, if I can't prove that they think I'm incompetent, what else could be true? When a lawyer is questioning a witness, they don't just accept, their version of the story or just one version of the events. A good lawyer knows that they need to consider other possibilities, other interpretations, other ways that the facts could be understood. One of my favorite ways of doing this when I used to go to court all the time is called cross-examination. Let's say we were in a courtroom and a witness came and said the story, right? They think I'm incompetent because I said something and I didn't say it perfectly. A good lawyer would ask, but isn't it possible that this other thing could be true as well? Yes or no, right? Isn't it also possible that maybe they were thinking about what they're having for lunch instead? Isn't it possible that maybe the moment meant nothing to them at all and only meant something to you? That's what a good lawyer is doing. It's like questioning and opening up possibilities to show that this one interpretation of what happened doesn't have to be the only possibility. We call these alternative facts. And here's the thing here, right? If the story that your brain came up with, the worst case scenario that your brain came up with, if your story has no evidence, then all these other possibilities are also plausible. They could also be just as true as the worst case scenario. Ooh, I love this because now it's like, it gives you permission. It gives you permission to think of more positive, right, interpretation of what happened. It allows your brain to kind of, right, like maybe I'm not in danger, right? Maybe I don't need protection right now. Maybe everything is fine. What if you considered a more positive possibility with the same intensity as you do with the worst case scenario? A quick example, right? Recently, I started posting on LinkedIn. Ugh, I know, yuck. I decided to start building my personal brand a bit more intentionally and being more vulnerable on LinkedIn and telling and allowing who I am to be seen, like who I am as a person, not just who I am as a professional. And that thing was scary. My brain was like coming up with the absolute worst case scenario. And it was, really going through these 4 questions that helped me overcome that fear. In conclusion, as a high achiever, you're told to, quiet your mind. But I think a more effective method is not to silence your mind, but to give it resolution. To go through this process and forcing it to prove itself to you. And when it can't, now it opens up possibilities for other things that might also be true. And that naturally will calm down your nervous system and calm down your mind so that you can relax, right? And that's why the answer isn't less thinking, but it's better thinking. That's when your thinking becomes your competitive advantage, because now you're not just thinking, you're examining, you have structure. You're not just worrying, you're analyzing, you're asking the right questions. And you're not just spiraling, you're investigating, you're looking at the facts. And that's a completely different use, and might I say more effective use of the same brain. So here's what I want you to do. I've prepared a 4-question interrogation workbook based on this video so that you can have it with you anytime you need to. It's completely free. Take one thing that you've been overthinking about a little bit too much this week and run it through those 4 questions. And I promise if you do it the right way and you're honest with yourself, you realize usually you have no real evidence of a threat. And you'll see exactly why this works. The link for it will be in the description below. And if you want to learn more about how I use my legal training as a strategy and a tool to improve your life, go ahead and subscribe and like this video if you do. I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.